Every empire believes it's different. That this time, the power, the currency, the influence will last forever. But history disagrees. In the last 500 years, 5 great empires have risen, dominated global trade, and then fallen. And every single one of them followed the same pattern. From the Portuguese Empire to the Spanish, from the Dutch to the British, and finally the American. Each believed their currency was untouchable, until it wasn't. And now, with record debt, rising inflation, and global powers challenging the U.S., the question is simple. Is the dollar next? Act 1. The pattern of power. Throughout history, empires rise not just through military might, but through money. It starts with innovation and trade. A nation discovers something new, a route, a technology, a system that gives it a massive advantage. Wealth flows in, cities grow, people prosper. Then comes finance. Banks, credit, and investments make growth easier. The empire becomes the center of global trade, and its currency becomes the world's reserve. But after success comes complacency. The empire spends more than it earns. Wars get expensive. Productivity falls. The rich get richer. The poor get angry. And then another power rises. The currency loses trust, and the cycle repeats. This pattern has played out almost exactly every 80 to 100 years. Let's go back to where it began. Act 2. The Portuguese Empire. The Age of Discovery, 1400s, 1600s. Portugal, a small, rugged nation on the edge of Europe, changed the world. In the 1400s, they perfected shipbuilding and navigation. They explored Africa, reached India, and eventually Brazil. For the first time in history, trade became global. Spices, gold, and slaves moved through Portuguese ports, and the Portuguese real became one of the most trusted currencies on earth. But wealth bred arrogance. Portugal taxed heavily, fought endless wars, and relied on colonies instead of innovation. By the 1600s, their fleets were aging. Their rivals, Spain and the Netherlands, were catching up. And just like that, the world's first global empire faded. Act 3. The Spanish Empire. The Age of Silver, 1500s, 1700s. Then came Spain. They discovered the New World, and with it, unimaginable riches. From the silver mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia, Spain flooded Europe with silver coins. For over a century, they financed wars, built cathedrals, and ruled the seas. But this was the first lesson of easy money. All that silver caused inflation. Prices soared. The economy weakened. Spain became dependent on imports and debt. And when the silver slowed down, the empire, once the richest in history, collapsed under its own weight. Their coin, the Spanish real, once the global standard, lost trust. And another trading nation stepped in. Act 4. The Dutch Empire. The Age of Capitalism, 1600s, 1700s. The Dutch were small but brilliant. They didn't conquer. They traded. In 1602, they founded the Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation. They invented the stock market, insurance, and the idea of shareholders. Amsterdam became the financial center of the world. The Dutch guilder was the world's first true reserve currency. But again, success bred excess. Wars with England drained resources. The Dutch economy slowed. And as power shifted across the English Channel, the guilder's dominance faded. Enter the British. Act 5. The British Empire. The Age of Industry, 1700s, 1900s. Britain industrialized before anyone else. Coal, steel, and steam transformed a small island into the workshop of the world. The British pound sterling became the global standard. At its peak, the British Empire controlled 1/4 of Earth's land and people. London was the financial capital of the world. But the costs of 2 world wars were devastating. By 1945, Britain was buried in debt. And across the Atlantic, a new power had risen, richer, stronger, and armed with a new global currency, the U.S. dollar. Act 6. the American Empire. The Age of Credit, 1945 present. After World War II, the United States was unstoppable. Half of the world's industrial output came from America. The dollar was backed by gold. Everyone wanted it. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, global leaders agreed. The U.S. dollar would be the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be tied to it. America printed the money. The world used it. But in 1971, something historic happened. President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It became backed by trust and the power of the U.S. government. At first, it didn't matter. America still led in technology, energy, and military might. But slowly, the same pattern began again. Debt skyrocketed. Manufacturing moved overseas. The country shifted from making things to financing things. And the dollar's dominance began to face its first real challenge. Act 7. The Signs of Decline, 1980s, present. Every empire falls the same way, gradually, then suddenly. For decades, the dollar has seemed invincible. It makes up 60% of global foreign reserves. Most trade, especially oil, happens in dollars. But cracks are starting to show. National debt has crossed $35 trillion. Inflation is eroding purchasing power. Interest payments on debt are now larger than the defense budget. And countries like China, Russia, and even U.S. allies are exploring alternatives. The BRICS nations are talking about a new trade currency. China is pushing the digital yuan and the petrodollar. The agreement that oil would only be sold in U.S. dollars is starting to weaken. Meanwhile, within America, wealth inequality is soaring. Just like the empires before it, the U.S. is spending more, producing less, and depending on debt to survive. Sound familiar? Act 8. The pattern repeats. The empire life cycle. Let's summarize the cycle. 1. Rise through innovation. 2. Prosper through trade. 3. Dominate through finance. 4. Decline through debt and inequality. 5. Collapse through inflation and conflict. Each empire lasted roughly 80 to 100 years. The U.S. dollar has been dominant since 1944. That's about 80 years. So if history rhymes, we're entering the final phase. But that doesn't mean the U.S. will disappear overnight. Decline is rarely a single event. It's a process. And it can take decades. Act 9. China and the new challengers. Every empire falls because another rises. Today, that challenger is China. In 1980, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. Today, it rivals the United States. It's the world's largest manufacturer, the biggest exporter, and the biggest trading partner for over 120 countries. The yuan isn't a global reserve yet, but it's growing fast. China is building parallel systems, BRICS payment networks, belt and road infrastructure projects, and digital currency systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Meanwhile, countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are quietly shifting trade away from the dollar. It's slow, subtle, but the trend is unmistakable. And it's not just China. India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, they all see a world where one country doesn't control global money. We're entering what some economists call the multipolar era, where power is shared, not centralized. Act 10. The consequences of dollar decline. So what happens if the dollar loses dominance? In the short term, chaos. Global trade relies on the dollar. Banks, governments, corporations all depend on it. If trust fades, markets panic. Inflation could spike. Borrowing becomes harder. And the U.S. loses one of its greatest advantages, the ability to print the world's money. For decades, America has been able to run huge deficits without consequence because everyone needed dollars. If that changes, living standards could drop, and the U.S. would face the same harsh reality previous empires did. You can't borrow your way to power forever. But there's another side to this story. Act 11. Can the dollar survive? History suggests decline is inevitable, but the U.S. still has massive strengths. It leads in technology, from AI to semiconductors. It still has the world's deepest capital markets. And most importantly, it's still trusted, far more than any rival currency. The dollar may weaken, but replacing it isn't easy. To become a global reserve, a currency needs open markets, transparent laws, and trust. China's economy is powerful, but it's not fully open. The euro is strong, but Europe is divided. Crypto is innovative but unstable. So while the dollar's dominance may fade, no clear replacement has emerged yet. In other words, the empire may decline, but it won't vanish overnight. Act 12. Lessons from history. When we zoom out, we see something bigger than money. Every empire rises because it creates value and falls when it consumes more than it creates. Portugal innovated. Spain extracted. The Dutch invested. Britain industrialized. America financed. Each step created more complexity, more leverage, and ultimately, more fragility. The pattern isn't about gold, silver, or dollars. It's about human nature. We innovate, we prosper, we grow arrogant, we overreach, we fall. And then the cycle begins again. Act 13. The new ERA, digital empires. Here's the twist. The next empire might not even be a country. In the 21st century, power is shifting from nations to networks. Tech giants control more users' data and influence than many governments. Bitcoin and blockchain have no borders. Artificial intelligence can move capital faster than central banks. The new empire might be digital, decentralized, data-driven, and leaderless. And its currency? Not the dollar, not the yuan, but code. We're watching the birth of a new financial order, one that will decide the next 500 years. So, is the dollar next? Maybe. But the story isn't about one currency falling. It's about how power, in every age, shifts from the old to the new. The Portuguese thought their ships would rule forever. The Spanish thought their silver would never run out. The Dutch believed finance would last forever. The British trusted in industry, and the Americans believed in credit. Every empire has its sunset. The only question is, who or what rises next? Maybe history doesn't repeat, but if it rhymes, we might already be hearing the next verse. Thanks for watching. If you found this story eye-opening, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks the dollar is untouchable. Because history doesn't lie. It just waits to be heard again.